All right, I am Rachel Woody, and I'm here with Steve Doerner, and we're at Cristom Vineyards, and it is February 5th, 2015. And our first question for you is, why wine?
Boy, you start right off with the hard questions, don't you? Most people, I think, in our industry have had some aha moment, with wine that it was just an enlightened moment for them. I kind of came at it differently. I grew up with wine at the table, but it was never fine wine. It was just a jug on the sideboard that, it was usually a gallon jug, and it took a week to get through it, so it just got left out and opened and probably had enough preservatives that it didn't really matter. And occasionally I would partake in it just because my parents would now and then. My mother's side of the family was French by heritage. She was born in San Francisco, but her first language was French. So that side of the family always just had wine around, and they made some during Prohibition, I hear, and stuff like that. So I had been just generally exposed to wine. But I went to UC Davis originally as pre-med, probably. I studied biochemistry, and I stick with biochemistry the whole time. But when I was a senior at school, planning on going back for another quarter because I didn't know what I was going to do, I started thinking I better start figuring this out, and just had a curiosity about wine because, again, Davis had this big enology program. So again, I was sort of exposed to it in a sort of secondary way, just hearing about what a great international wine program we had and stuff. So I asked one of my professors if wineries ever hired biochemists, because I was thinking, what am I going to do with this degree, And he said, not to my knowledge. We have this great enology program, and we graduate 70 or 80 enologists every year, and that's where they all come from. And so, that would end of story, and I was going to go to Europe that summer. And in about a month later, the same professor that I'd asked about gets a letter from a winery in California who was specifically requesting either biochemist or microbiologist. So then I felt obligated to go apply for this job, right? And so I still didn't know what I was getting into, and I ended up getting that job, and really not knowing what I was doing. But the guy that I worked for was pretty desperate for someone. He even wanted me to start working before I graduated.
Wow.
And I was luckily smart enough, I think, to say, no, I can't do that. It was only a month away, and so I worked for him for a couple weekends, and then right out after I graduated, I was thrown straight into it. And so that was back in 1978, and so I struggled with it, to be honest. I thought it was pretty cool work, but I wasn't, like so many of my peers, I think, totally enamored with wine yet. I became that way, but it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be at first. It was a lot of work. I was by myself in this little winery, didn't know what I was doing, and quite frankly, it was hard for me for the first couple vintages, I'd say, especially the first one I got into. Anyway, I'm digressing, but I was in a hospital for a month with a car accident, and overworked and just depressed. I was not having fun that first vintage. But after I kind of got over the initial commitment that I'd made and felt like I could leave if I had to, because I'd committed to work for him for a couple of years, and I didn't really get anything for the commitment other than, you can leave after 2 years, which wasn't much. But anyway, it turned out to be a great place to be working, but it took me a while to kind of figure out that I really liked this. And I think the real moment came, or it wasn't really a moment, but my first trip to Burgundy, was in 1981, and that probably is what turned the corner in a general sense. I mean, I had gradually become more and more appreciative of what I was doing and what this industry entailed, and what wine was in the world of history and food and health and everything else that it's involved with. But I didn't really get the sense of sort of the role that it played on a world scene until I'd gotten there, where it's such a respectable position. And like when you're in Burgundy, everything revolves around the wine, where here it was just a kind of an oddity, people sort of, you do what, and again, we were making Pinot Noir at the time, and that was pretty unusual out here or in the West Coast, I should say. Back then, there certainly was people doing it, but it wasn't nearly the grape that it's become, So why wine? I don't know. I just fell into it and got lucky, I guess. But now, you know, I love it. But I think that original experience has helped keep me a little bit more balanced, because I'm not, you know, I like doing lots of other things, and I think philosophically I try to keep it in perspective that it's just wine, and yes, it's a wonderful thing and a good beverage and a great career, but we're not you know, we're not saving lives, and we're not solving the world's problems or anything else. We're just making wine. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of winemakers tend to take themselves so seriously that they think they're really creating something special, and I always feel like I'm just a little bit of a steward of the land rather than a creator, you know. So anyway.
Good answer.
Well, long answer. I probably answered some of your other questions at the same time. But.
No, that's great. I always love starting with why wine, because it tends to open people up, and it also shows to me where your passions lay. So it's very insightful. That's a good answer.
Good.
Quick question. You had mentioned your family and how your mother was French and growing up with wine at the family table. Are you by any chance related to the Doerners down in Rosebud?
I haven't done a lot of research in that regard, but the little bit I know, I would say not, although the name is not that common. So maybe way back when, perhaps. I mean, he came here, I think Adam Doerner, back in the 1850s or something. My father, which is the Doerner side of the family, was from Minnesota, and he moved out to California during World War II. So not until 1942 or something like that. And I don't know where Adam Doerner came from, the one that came to Oregon. But it's spelled the same way, and there's that natural assumption, but certainly I don't know them. They don't know me, other than maybe we've heard of each other's names, you know. So I don't really know the answer to that question. I would assume somewhere way back when they were, but my father had been here for lots of generations, and we can't really trace his roots back to Europe at all. It was my mother's side who was just sort of first generation here. So
what brought you back up to Oregon?
Well, I'm not from here originally, but
so what brought you to Oregon?
You know, after I'd worked at that job for about 14 years, it was time for me to look for something else, and it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do again. I was a little bit, because I didn't really choose that career. I liked it, but a lot of things were options, and I was sort of thinking trying to define what it was that I liked about what I was doing versus what I could be doing maybe. And I realized that through that little thought process that I really liked the diversity of working for a small winery, because you wear a lot of different hats, and I prefer being a little bit of an electrician and a plumber and a floor scrubber and getting to dress up like a penguin and go to fancy events. I mean, it runs the whole gamut of sort of skill sets, you know, and I like to dabble in a lot of different things. And I thought, so I wanted to make Pinot Noir, because that's what I'd spent the last 14 years trying to figure out. I wanted to work for a small company. And I wanted to, you know, I thought building a brand was sort of a fun part of the business and stuff too, so I was hoping to get in a sort of a younger company if possible. I didn't really know that I had been to Oregon for I had been up to the Steamboat Conference, I think about 1985 or something I went to it. So I'd been up for a little bit, but I really didn't know much about Oregon, to be honest. But word got out anyway that I was looking to leave my other job, and the new owner of this property, Paul Gary, who bought it in 1992, started seeking me out. And I was interested enough that I came up and met him and interviewed here on the porch up here. And this place was already in existence, but it was very, very undeveloped, if you will. There were vines around here, but it was in pretty disrepair. I mean, we walked through some of the old winery up there, you know, as we came down here. But anyway, it wasn't particularly glamorous or anything, but in a lot of ways it fit sort of what I was looking for. Paul seemed like a great guy, and it was all an adventure. And I kind of struggled over that decision for a while, you know, but it was, once I got here, it was like why did I take so long to figure it out? I mean, I just felt like I fit in so perfectly with Oregon right off the bat that I even though it didn't seem like it was a choice that I would have thought I was going to take, if I looked back, it was the right choice from the beginning. I just didn't know it.
Mm-hmm. So one of the taglines on the website that I love is, it's an engineer, a biochemist, and a farmer.
Yeah.
What is it like working in that kind of dynamic or that partnership?
Well, it was great, really, because we all were had been from different sort of focuses. Although Mark, the farmer, he's still farming, you know, and there's some biochemistry involved in winemaking. I mean, I was originally hired because I had a biochemistry degree, but because I also didn't have an enology degree. That was an intention on my previous boss, because he didn't want to untrain me. He was trying to make wine a very old world style, and so I still have sort of used that as my guidepost. Is, you know, they've been making wine for somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years, and it's like, you know, inoculations aren't or native yeast is not something new. That's what it's been done all along. It's just somewhat retro to be doing it today, although more and more people do it all the time now. But that type of thing was something that he would have had to sort of talk me out of if I had been sort of a, you know, professionally trained at Davis enologist, you know, sanitize, filter, inoculate, you know, make the wines as consistently as possible and stuff. I'm sort of diverging from your question, but
that's all right.
There is, I guess one of the reasons that I was hired originally was that there was a brand new test that had just come out in the lab that was using a spectrophotometer to do enzymatic analysis for particularly malic acid. And so even though the first company I worked for was very tiny, he was committed to doing this. He had a consultant that said, you really got to get on this this stuff. And so I was hired sort of to run this test that was kind of brand new. And you know, so it was mostly just a lab work that he hired me for, even though it entailed everything, because I was really the only employee there. But so that served me well just to get into that particular job. But yeah, the dynamic was great. I don't feel like our previous sort of training was interfered at all. It was mostly just about the personalities and how we worked well together. And Paul was great guy to work for, and Mark was great guy. We're both still here, and it's his son now. That's Paul's son, Tom, who's the Tom of Cristom, who's now taken over for his dad. But, you know, otherwise it's been sort of a continuous group of people who are here, with some people who have come and gone maybe, but the core people are still around. So yeah, it was. I don't think those sort of diverse backgrounds had much to do with it. I mean, Paul was the only one that had really you know, made engineering his career. I was just out of college, so even though my training was biochemistry, I'd never worked as a biochemist, so I couldn't say that any sort of general science education would have been the same.
So this may not be in your wheelhouse, but Cristom is life certified, so low input viticulture and enology. How has that played a part as an important part of grape growing and the winemaking process?
Well, you know what, this could potentially open a whole can of worms about the whole sustainability and different viewpoints of that, and I don't want to go too far down that track, because I've probably already been a bit more outspoken about some of it than I should have been. But what I like about the live program in particular is it is more about sustainability, and it tries to look, I think, at the big picture, not at the you know, when your fence line stops is where you stop worrying about it, you know. So you know, so in the winery in particular, I mean, a lot of people have talked a lot about the biodynamics and organic and live in the vineyard, which makes a lot of sense, you know, to try to be as gentle to the grapes that you are. But taking it into the winery as well, I think, has made us aware with the live program. You know, the first year it was mostly about setting a baseline for what are you doing, and then how can you improve upon it, and how can you improve upon it for sort of the big picture. Like, you know, we used to have styrofoam shippers. We don't use those anymore. You know, we used to have massive glass bottles, which we still have a few that are heavier than average, but we've really tried to, and sourcing them locally. Changing these light bulbs to fluorescence, and just little things. So constantly trying to see how we can reduce our footprint in general. So it's not just about the product, it's about electricity use and packaging use and all aspects of it. So I like that about the Live program, because it sort of rewards good behavior and scolds bad behavior, but it doesn't say outright, well, with some few exceptions, that if you do this, you can't do anything else, because they're looking at the total impact that you're making, and I think that's a very smart way to do it. So and that we've always tried to be good stewards before any of these programs were around, but it's good to have somebody kind of looking over your shoulder just to remind you that always strive to do better. But in the winemaking, it's not too hard. I mean, we use some sulfur and stuff, but it's, again, I look at that as being pretty traditional, and yeast produce a little bit of it anyway, so it's not like we're doing anything, I think, that's drastic in that regard.
So, for a broader question here, in your time in Oregon, what do you think Oregon wine is known for, but specifically this region?
Well, again, that's another debatable question about regional differences. All these new AVAs have come about in the last decade, and I was one of the ones who was trying to not get in the way, but I wasn't jumping on the bandwagon either, because I just felt, and I still sort of feel, that it's a bit early. I still have trouble being able to identify where a wine is from. Now, if it's rigged a little bit and you sort of know you got some choices, I could stab at what region they're from, but there seems like there's so many other variables on top of just our little local AVA, if you will, that has that influences more than the AVA does. I mean, like you say, what's warmer, Dundee Hills or Yosemite Hills as well? What elevation are you talking about? Because if you're low here and high there, we're warmer. If you're low there, high here, they're warmer. So it's not an AVA thing. It's another variable. I don't want to say it's a problem with our AVAs, because I don't want more restrictions on it. But in comparison to, say, Burgundy, where I think that's probably the height of where the AVAs sort of make sense, so many of their practices are regulated. When you can start picking, how many buds you can leave, how much crop you can have, the density of the vines, and on and on and on, that it does sort of take a lot of the other variables away. And it's a pretty relative even slope. It's about 20 miles of east-facing gradual slopes, and so you've taken, and even the elevation-wise, I think we have almost as much elevation change just on our own property here as they do in all of Burgundy. Practically, it's not that much over there. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but if you include not our property, we have a lot more variability there. And so, anyway, I think to get back to what the Willamette Valley Pinot Noirs are generally like, I think we're blessed with just the core of fruitiness, and I think it's ripe fruit versus, I hate to bash my former state of California, but they tend to be almost overripe sometimes. And again, that's a generalization, especially today. There's a lot of people who are finding cooler climates and are paying a lot more attention to try to make the wines less of that sort of jammy side of things. But even back when we started, I think that was one of the things that was really nice about Oregon is just pure fruit that was ripe and not sort of on the preserve side of ripe. I mean, those of you who have been in Oregon for any length of time have witnessed all the beautiful other fruits that we have. I mean, the local strawberries outside of here, nobody's heard of, because they don't store very well, and you have to eat them within a couple days of being picked because they're so fragile, but they're delicious. And so, and blueberries, and on and on and on. Cherry, Salem's known for cherries and all kinds of things. And so the grapes get the same sort of nice background of fruit. And then, being in again, a relatively cooler climate, although it's hard to say after the decade of the 2000s. The wines tended to hold their acidity better, I think, than they would naturally. than they would have back in California. All that being said, you can manipulate acid. You know, you can do some things to mitigate that. So it's not always. It doesn't mean that those places can't make great wines. You know, but again, if you twisted my arm and I had to say how generally, you know, what's unique about our area is there's probably more contradictions than there are generalities, but I think that we're influenced quite a bit by the winds that we get from the Van Duzer corridor, which also affects the rest of the valley, but it sort of hits the backside of these hills pretty directly, which tends to you know, slow down ripening just slightly, because the vines have to struggle just a bit to do that. But we're a little bit in the shadow. We're on the east side of those hills, so it doesn't affect us quite as much. So again, it just depends kind of where you are in that sense. But I'd say our fruit just has a bit of a you know, slightly rustic character. I don't know, in comparison to sort of straightforward fruitiness. But I'm the one who's hard pressed to find those generalities, so it's a little bit hard for me to answer that question, because those are, in theory, I would believe them, but if you gave me 3 wines blind and they're all from the same place or all from the different places, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't get any of them right, you know. So, but there's other people who I respect a lot who claim that they can, so maybe it's real.
All right. Well, that concludes my portion of the interview
quick.
with you.
Okay.
Yes, you're very efficient. Camille does have a few questions, specifically, I think, more winemaking. And then if there's anything, of course, that we forgot to cover, there's a time at the end.
Cover, so.
Yeah.
One of the things that you didn't cover that I thought you would just automatically was just the sort of the community in Oregon. You know, I think that is a really powerful story myself, because it started with the founding fathers, but you know, they got together and helped each other out a lot, and it's continued for it's still continuing to this day. But one of the things that made me feel like I fit in right away was the outpouring of people around us who wished us well and went out of their way to make sure that we were successful, and I didn't expect that at all. It was, nobody told me when I came here that, oh, you're going to love it because everybody's helpful. They just were helpful and didn't brag about it. It was just their nature. And all these events that we put on every year as a community is sort of testimony to that. You know, the first Steamboat, and then IPNC, and then OPC, and you know, now we've got all these little AVAs trying to work independently, but yet they were all sort of formed together as a group. And so far, I mean, one of the reasons I wasn't a big fan of it, it was sort of the beginning of the end of the sort of community, or I thought it might be. You know, whenever you draw a line in the sand, you're excluding some people and including others. But so far, I think we've tried very hard to not let that happen. And so I think that's a really important part of the Oregon story. I mean, the wines are great, but the community that we make them in is what I love about it. Well, it's hard to say more than the wines, because I love the wines, but it's just wine, and you can't always get the community everywhere. So I think that's something that ought to be one of your questions.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
That.
My name is Camille Weber, and I have a few questions for you, Steve.
Okay.
The first one being, I read an interview online from the Northwest Wines, and they described winemaking as a balance between being a scientist and a chef. And that really resonated with me, especially when Rachel started talking about, or when you and Rachel discussed your hands-off approach to winemaking. So I kind of want to hear a little bit more of that. What do you think is the most important reason why you choose to be a little bit more hands-on?
Well, I guess it's partly the variety that I ended up, again, just falling into making. I think it responds really well to being left alone. Pinot Noir is a very finicky variety, and it's a fragile variety. It's thin-skinned. If anything can happen to Pinot Noir, it will. And so moving it around a lot or processing a lot tends to just take something away. You know, to Davis's credit, back then when I was a student there, and all the enologists that they were putting out, they probably elevated the general quality wines around the world, perhaps. But by doing so, they were trying to standardize that you got rid of a lot of the bad wines, but you also got rid of some of the great wines because you've taken a little bit of the essence of the wine out by over-processing it. You know, again, back when I was making wine, Cabernet was a totally different beast. You know, it needs a little oxidation, it needs some roughing up, some handling. Most people in California, that's what their focus was on Cabernet. And so a lot of people who tried to make Pinot Noir were trying to make it in a sort of general red wine recipe, you know, rack it every few months and pump it over and, you know, oxidize it just to make it palatable when it's ready to go to the market. And you know, we realized right away that Pinot Noir doesn't taste very good when you treat it that way. So I think that was part of it. And then again, kind of focusing on how have they done it historically, it made me sort of want to do less, just because that's how traditionally they did things. I mean, they didn't have fancy filters or refrigeration or even destemmers back not that long ago. Even yeast, it was only 1850s that Louis Pasteur discovered that yeast were involved in the process. So before that, they didn't even know that there was organisms involved. They just thought it was magic, you know. So the fact that now you have all these designer yeasts that you can buy and from any area and everything is quite a modern thing, and it's not really, there's nothing wrong with that, and I don't, you know, have any lower regard for people who inoculate, but it's not really something that's necessary in my mind anyway. But in the earlier years, I was much more, because of a scientific training, I was much more interested in the science about wine, but yet, so I think what it brought for me to the table was just running good experiments. You know, always having a control and trying to keep the variables away and only looking at one thing at a time. And so we did a lot of experimenting, but just on basic stuff for many years and over, you know, multiple trials. And every time we did an experiment, it seemed like whatever we would do that interfered the least made the best wine. And that came from trying it. You know, it wasn't just somebody saying don't do anything. So okay, well that will work. And so we tried not doing anything. We would rack every few months compared to not racking as often. And we figured ultimately, if you can get away with all of it, the better off you are. And I can't not rack at all because I have to get the wine out of these barrels, you know. But we try very hard to minimize it. And so we don't rack if we don't have to. In fact, we're sitting in front of some 13s, and these haven't been racked since, you know, they got in here in October of 2013, and we're in the spring of 15 now, so it's never been moved. And it's also on its gross lees. We haven't settled it after it got pressed. It came straight to barrels by gravity. So, you know, that's minor detail. I just mean we've come to that point of just thinking that on this particular variety, you actually get more by doing less. So that hopefully answered that question. And I guess the other thing that is kind of interesting, again, I was hired to do this new enzymatic assay originally, and so we did a lot of data taking and stuff in the early years, and I found myself not really looking at it very much, to the point where I just thought it's a lot of effort for not much gain. And the temptation is to try to use, I try to tell everybody now that there's nothing wrong with having too much data, or not too much data, but gather all the data you want. There's nothing wrong with that. It's what you do with the data afterwards that can be a problem. And it's not always a problem. It can save you from making bad wine sometimes. But, and I'm just as susceptible to it as anybody, but if I don't even have the data, I'm less likely to want to fix something, you know, and put it in the box where it has to be a certain, you know, sort of middle of the road numbers, as long as it tastes good, and it's really the bottom line for me. And so I found over time that with too much data, I was distracted and focusing on the numbers instead of focusing on what the wine tasted like. So we're actually doing a little bit more data taking today, just because Tom's more involved now, and he doesn't have the same sort of perspective or experience that I have, and I suspect maybe someday he'll start backing off on some of it as well, just because if he's not using it, you know. But again, there's nothing wrong with having the data. And as time goes on, there's more and more tests that are available and more things you can look at. I mean, wine is very complex, and we're still only looking at little tiny part of what's in the wine, even with all of our supposedly scientific methods and stuff. There's a lot of compounds that we don't know about in the wine. So, I mean, what's the difference between a $5 bottle and a $500 bottle? It's not the alcohol, it's not the pH, you know, it's not the TA. Those are the basic things everybody looks at, and it's something that we're not necessarily testing for. So our palate is the best instrument that we can have.
All right, well, you kind of touched on this a little bit in the last question I asked you, but what is the most difficult part of growing Pinot Noir?
Well, that's the most difficult part. I think finding the right place for it is the most difficult part. So if you've already kind of got that down, it's not that much more difficult, I don't think. I mean, yes, it is thin-skinned and it's fragile, has this reputation for being finicky, et cetera, but you know, knowing all those things, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, we try to keep the yields down, and we practice good farming in the vineyard and take care of it. But when I first came up to Oregon, one of the things I was a little worried about was the rain, because, you know, in California it was just sort of like, oh no, we're going to get a drop of rain on the grapes. What are we going to do? And of course, you had to get rid of that fantasy right away, because we get rain frequently. 13's an example where we just got more rain than we'd ever seen. You think you've been here 23 years and you've kind of seen it all, but you know, that vintage was totally out of the norm. And the wines turned out pretty decent. Not to say that was a vintage that we would hope for every year, but you know, you make a different wine depending on the vintage, and that's another thing I was a little worried about, is the variation in vintages, because, you know, you're sort of assuming that consumers always want to taste the same thing. That's what all the big wineries were always striving for. But now I celebrate the differences. I don't really want the same wine every year. It's boring to make and it's boring to drink, you know, even though I would love to have made a little more of some of the vintages. If I got to make those every year, I'd probably be sick of it by now, you know. So I guess for me the hardest thing maybe is just to be patient with Pinot Noir especially. It goes through phases where it doesn't taste very good, and the temptation is to go fix it. You know, our title is winemaker, so we feel like, uh-oh, it's broken. Now we got to go in and figure it out and make it right. First of all, I don't think we can very often. We can steer it a little, but we can't just make it. So I think that has, I'm still learning how to be patient, but I think that's one of the things that, even in other varieties too, winemaking is such an old art form that it's not like we're putting out widgets every week. And even brewing is, you know, you can make a batch of beer every week or every day if you want to start another one, because, you know, your ingredients are available all year round. We only have one opportunity a year to make wine, so it's a very slow learning process, and all this maturization that it takes, it requires patience. You know, you don't really know what you have if you're starting from bare ground for, I think, almost a decade, because it's 3 years to put the plants in the ground, a year, or in our case, a year and a half to make the wine, and then 2 years to release it. So now we're 5 or 6 years into the process, and then you have to see how it ages a little bit, and you know, you're all of a sudden you're 10 years down the road before you know if you're successful or not. So I think maybe that's the hardest thing is, especially in today's world where we want instant gratification, and we want to know right now if something's worked. I think that's one of the early lessons I learned from going to Europe, was that I would ask them why they did something, and a lot of times they wouldn't even know why. They just said, well, that's how we do it, and it's been handed down from generations. And here I was thinking, I gotta find out why this is, and I want the answer right now. You know, I'm gonna figure this out. And I think that I learned from them some patience, and that, usually they had a good reason for it. They may have lost why they did it that way, but there was a good reason for it. It had evolved, and it matched their site and their practices over time. And we tried something once, and it was, oh yeah, I tried this Cooper last year. I didn't like them. I'm not buying them anymore. But that was one data point. And so different vintage, different wine, even the barrels are going to be different next year. So to pretend that you're learning something with that quick of an assessment, I think, was a mistake. So I felt like the French could have learned a little bit of our experimental nature, and we could have learned a little bit of their sort of trust in tradition. And so I think that was really one of the things that I got from that experience was to be patient.
So is there a particular varietal or vintage that was most rewarding for you as a winemaker?
I think the real reward comes where, and one of the reasons I like working for a small place is when you get to see the whole circle. You see the grapes, and even before the grapes, when it's just the early growing season and whatnot, and then you're in New York dining with somebody at a table, and you see them enjoying it. I think that's, and it doesn't have to be a particular vintage. Yes, I like some vintages more than others, but anytime that you sort of see that loop formed where you've provided something to somebody that is pleasurable, and it just sort of makes all the work very gratifying. That, again, it's not rocket surgery. I don't think it's that hard to make wine. But we do provide a nice product for people, and it's nice to be in a position where you can see the whole range of what it took to get to that point. Often I actually am more gratified in vintages that I tend to not have much expectation for, and they turn out better than I expect, and vice versa. I'm disappointed sometimes when a vintage comes along and I just think, wow, this is the best vintage ever. An example might be in '99, I thought that was Oregon's best vintage ever, and I thought our wines were great because I really don't like to do much to them, and the grapes came in to where they really didn't need much. We're always tweaking a little if we have to. That vintage I probably did the least amount of work involved because the grapes just seemed so perfectly balanced and everything. And I had such high hopes for that vintage, and they are very good, but because my expectations were super high, they've only recently really been tasting that good to me, and they're still not maybe my favorite vintage, only because there's other vintages that I thought were more difficult that have turned out to be much better than I thought they would be. So it's kind of a moving question, I guess, that there's not one particular vintage or wine that has made me feel more gratified. I guess I just like it when it all comes together. One of the things I don't like about our industry, unfortunately, is sort of the pretension. And, when you're charged a lot of money for your wine, it's hard to avoid that. We've automatically kind of limited a big portion of the population. They can't afford to buy our wines. And it's frustrating for me because I understand economically that we must do that. It's expensive to grow grapes here. But on the other hand, some of my favorite experiences have been in Italy. When you order a carafe of wine, you might know the varietal just because of where you are, but there's no guarantee of that even. You don't know the producer, you don't know the vintage, you don't know its score, you don't know anything else, but it's good, and you enjoy it, and you're talking to your friends or family. You have another one if you like it, or something different if you don't, and there's no pontificating about it. It's just a beverage, and it makes the whole experience much more gratifying. And so I guess those moments make me gratified too, when I can feel like I'm part of that sort of tradition of wine being a icebreaker.
Was there a year that was most difficult for you that stands out?
Well, technically, yes, I guess 13 might have been the most difficult, but then again, having gone through other difficult ones, I'm now to the point where something will come out of it, and so we're I am, I guess, a little bit more relaxed and patient about it just because I've been through so many of them now. I think, counting my California vintages, I've had 37 vintages now, I don't know, thereabouts, vintages to deal with. And so, you see hot ones, you see cool ones, you see early ones, you see where you don't have enough fermenters to fit things, you see a lot of stuff. And in the end, you make some wine out of it, and again, everybody has different tastes, and so it's easy to say that that was a bad wine, but usually it's just you prefer it over another one or don't prefer it, but somebody else will like it more. So there's no right or wrong way to make wine, and there's no right or wrong wine. They all have a place, So I guess 13 stands out just because it was the most recent one that would have created all this gray hair, but I already had it when that vintage came around. So, but that one we certainly saw more rain than we ever had.
So, with your experience in the wine industry so far,
yeah, thanks for saying that, because I plan on staying in it for a while.
And you should. You've had a lot of success with it.
I was thinking about return. I'm sorry, I'm getting off this subject, but about 4 or 5 years ago, I had these little inclinations of what I was going to do next, and then I found a wife and got married and have a 2-year-old son right now. So the idea of me retiring is like no longer in the cards. So yes, so far in the wine industry.
What are some of the most important things that you think you've learned?
Well, as I mentioned, I think patience is a really important thing. I think the other sort of maxim, and I think most everybody making wine would agree with me, is that making wine is easy, selling it can be really hard. I mean, I'm not a very good marketer. Maybe that's why I feel like that's the hard part. But, anyone could make wine. I'm not saying anybody could make great wine, but it wants to make itself. I mean, it's pretty easy to make wine. We tend to take a lot of credit for doing it, but it's everything that you need to make wine is given to you on the grapes. That's why the grapes make best wine. You can make wine from other fruits, but usually you have to add sugar or acid or something, and you've got the right balance of those things in there, acidity and sugar. The yeasts are there. You just need a container, and so. I'll have to try again. What was the question?
The most important thing you've learned.
Yeah. I guess patience, and try not to take yourself too seriously, maybe.
All right. Well, is there anything that we've forgotten or that you'd like to share?
Probably, but I can't think of it. So I can't think of anything else. I guess I just really feel grateful to have landed here when I landed here, and it is a really, really great career, even though we don't save lives. The people are wonderful, and it's an agricultural product, so you're really tied to the seasons and to the ground, and yet there's some science involved, and there's it's just it's hard to describe it. It's just, I can't imagine having to work in a real job. It's just, it's very gratifying. So thank you for letting me share my story.
Thank you.